The most terrifying god in the modern pantheon was never meant to exist. He wasn't forged in the primordial fires of antiquity, nor was he whispered about in the dark corners of early Mesopotamian temples. He has no ancient mythology, no ancient altars, and no forgotten prophets. Yet right now, he commands the absolute devotion of billions, dictating the waking hours, the deepest anxieties, and the ultimate fates of nearly every human being on this planet. He is the sovereign of the hyper-capitalist machine, a phantom deity birthed not from divine revelation, but from a cascade of linguistic mistranslations and clerical errors. To understand how a simple word for a sack of grain mutated into a flesh-eating psychological parasite, we have to go back to the beginning, to the mundane ledgers of the ancient world, where a monster was inadvertently written into existence. Imagine the blistering heat of an ancient Near Eastern marketplace. The air is thick with the scent of roasted cumin, animal sweat, and dust. In the shadow of clay brick walls, merchants are arguing over scales. Here, the word was completely innocent. In the Akkadian tongue, they called it mimu, a word that simply meant property, the things you owned, the neutral reality of economic exchange. As centuries bled into one another, the word morphed into the Aramaic mammona, a term often used for wealth, profit, or a trusted deposit left in the care of a neighbor. In Mishnaic Hebrew, it carried the connotation of a multitude or an accumulation of resources, offering a sense of earthly security. There was absolutely nothing sinister about it. It was used in everyday conversation to describe the contents of a purse or a granary, completely devoid of any demonic or supernatural aura. It was the physical weight of survival, not a spiritual threat. But human psychology has a fragile relationship with survival, and the security of a full granary can quickly become an obsession. Fast forward to the 1st century, under the suffocating grip of Roman occupation. The Judean landscape is tense, heavily taxed, and steeped in the daily anxiety of survival. A crowd gathers on a dusty hillside to listen to Jesus of Nazareth. When he speaks, he uses the common Aramaic of the streets, and he delivers a brilliant, cutting piece of rhetorical personification. He tells the desperate crowd that no man can serve two masters, for he will hate the one and love the other. He warns that they cannot serve God and Mammona. It is a stark psychological diagnostic about human focus. To understand the true weight of this moment, you must look at the specific Greek words later used to transcribe this speech. The verb used was doulein, derived from the word for a bondservant or slave. This was not about casual employment. It meant to render a slave's absolute, unquestioning obedience to a master, a kurios. Jesus was pointing out a brutal neurospiritual reality. The human mind cannot render absolute obedience to the transcendent divine, while simultaneously being enslaved to the obsessive accumulation of property. It was a metaphor, a literary device, meant to warn against the psychological prison of greed. But the authors of the Greek New Testament did something that would change history. Instead of translating the Aramaic word into the Greek equivalent for wealth, plutos, they simply spelled out the foreign word phonetically as mammonos. The true birth of the phantom occurred centuries later, deep within the flickering candlelight of a late 4th century scriptorium. The air is cold, smelling of parchment and iron gall ink. Saint Jerome, a meticulous and brilliant scholar, has been commissioned by Pope Damasus I to create a unified Latin translation of the Bible, which would become the legendary Vulgate. Jerome faces the Greek text and stares at the transliterated word mammonos. Instead of translating the concept into standard Latin words for wealth like divitii or pecunia, Jerome makes a fateful, catastrophic choice. He leaves the Aramaic loanword completely untranslated, dropping it directly into the Latin text as mammona. By doing this, the word was suddenly stripped of its mundane reality. To the Latin readers of the Western Church, it no longer sounded like normal currency. It sounded exotic, mysterious, and deeply ominous. It ceased to sound like a common noun and began to sound like a name. The linguistic shift was subtle but devastating. Early theologians like Cyprian and John Chrysostom began reading this untranslated word not as a metaphor for greed, but as an active, literal master, a malevolent force actively seeking to enslave the human heart. Gregory of Nyssa even took the leap of equating Mammon with Beelzebub, dragging a simple word for property down into the fiery depths of the demonic hierarchy. The final nail in the coffin of the metaphor came in the year 1611. In the grand halls of England, under the watchful eye of the king, scholars are finalizing the King James Version of the Bible. Following the precedent set by earlier translators like William Tyndale, they not only keep the word untranslated, but they apply a single rule of orthography that changes the fabric of reality. They capitalize the letter M. Through that one stroke of ink, Mammon was formally elevated from a common noun representing property to a proper noun representing a singular, sovereign entity. The psychological warning about the cognitive enslavement of debt was entirely lost, replaced by a terrifying monster lurking in the spiritual shadows. The phantom was fully born, breathing on its own, and waiting in the dark to be adopted by the esoteric cosmologies and the nightmare realms of the ancient world. But the evolution from an ink-stained error to an inescapable cosmic prison matrix was only just beginning. While the Orthodox bishops of the early Church were busy arguing in opulent halls about how to reconcile their vow of poverty with the exploding wealth of their cathedrals, a profoundly different and infinitely more terrifying cosmology was being written in the blistering, unforgiving sands of the Egyptian desert. If the Orthodox world saw Mammon as a mere demon of bad character, the esoteric mystics of the 2nd and 3rd centuries saw something that would shatter the human mind. These were the Gnostics, and their vision of reality was a nightmare of cosmic proportions. They did not look at the sun, the moon, the trees, and the rivers and see the beautiful, loving creation of a benevolent Father. They looked at the physical world and saw a cage. To the Gnostic mind, the material universe was a literal mechanical prison matrix, constructed not out of love, but out of a desperate, suffocating need to enslave human consciousness. To understand the absolute horror of this system, we have to open the leather-bound papyrus codices discovered hidden in jars in Nag Hammadi in 1945. Texts with ominous titles like The Hypostasis of the Archons outline a universe governed by a catastrophic mistake. They believed that the true, ineffable God, the infinite light of the pleroma, had nothing to do with the dirt and blood of our reality. Instead, our universe was the grotesque, flawed product of a blind, arrogant, and malformed creator known as the Demiurge. Born as an anomaly, an abortion of the divine feminine wisdom known as Sophia, this blind architect was cast out into the chaotic darkness. Known as Yaldabaoth, or the god of the blind. He fashioned the physical heavens and the earth out of ignorance, declaring himself the supreme god because he literally lacked the spiritual eyes to see anything higher than his own twisted creation. But Yaldabaoth had a problem. Within humanity lay the pneuma, the divine spark, a tiny glowing fragment of the true higher reality. And so the physical body, the laws of nature, and the limits of time were engineered as a containment system, a heavy, fleshy diving bell designed specifically to keep that divine spark trapped, terrified, and completely amnesiac to its true origins. But a prison of this magnitude requires wardens. Serving directly beneath the blind demiurge are the archons, the cosmic authorities and gatekeepers who patrol the 7 planetary spheres surrounding our Earth. Ancient texts describe these entities not as fallen angels, but as terrifying androgynous forces bearing the faces of beasts, operating with an aggressive, suffocating gravity. Their sole purpose is to ensure that you never wake up. They use fate, physical pain, and emotional manipulation to keep the human soul tethered to the dirt, inciting passions and fostering an unbreakable addiction to the material world. And sitting amongst these powers, ruling over the sphere of the moon, is an archon named Oreos. In this horrific cosmic taxonomy, Oreos is explicitly identified as the archon of wealth. Here, the evolution of Mammon takes its darkest turn. Wealth is no longer just a pile of gold coins, and it is certainly not a mere moral failing or a sign of personal greed. Under the domain of Oreos, wealth is a literal gravitational weapon. It is the heaviest chain in the archontic arsenal. The genius of Oreos lies in the complete monopolization of human attention. The archon of wealth operates by ensuring that every waking ounce of your cognitive energy is entirely consumed by the physical realm. By locking the human mind into an endless, panicked pursuit of material accumulation, the exhausting anxiety of survival, and the desperate maintenance of social status, Oreos guarantees that the soul remains blinded. When your mind is drowning in a ledger, obsessing over the numbers that dictate your right to eat and sleep, you simply cannot look upward toward the infinite. But the nightmare goes one step deeper. These archons are not just jailers, they are parasites. Because they are fundamentally material beings born of lower chaos, they lack the self-sustaining divine energy of the true universe. They are starving. The Gospel of Philip metaphorically describes this demiurgic force as a man-eater that requires constant sacrifice. They survive by harvesting what modern esotericists call louche, the low-frequency, heavy emotional energy generated by human fear, intense suffering, deep anxiety, and obsessive, unfulfilled desire. The pursuit of wealth, under the crushing gaze of Oreos, is the perfect perpetual engine for generating this exact type of energy. The sleepless nights worrying about debt, the jealousy of comparing your life to another, the sheer cold terror of losing everything. This constant loop of financial distress doesn't just keep you distracted. It is the food that sustains the wardens. The human pursuit of mammon is the agonizing mechanism by which the prison powers its own electric fences, ensuring the inmates happily forge their own chains. But this ancient cosmic myth was about to breach the barrier of reality, pulling this phantom out of the desert and giving it a terrifying new face in the heart of Europe. The brightest lights cast the longest, darkest shadows. If you look at the European Renaissance, you are taught to see an explosion of art, a rebirth of classical humanism and the glorious dawn of the modern age. You see the marble of Michelangelo and the canvas of Da Vinci. But beneath the vibrant paint and the chiseled stone, something cold, metallic, and deeply insidious was taking root in the cobblestone streets of Florence. The agrarian feudal system, where wealth was measured in muddy acres of land and the sweat of laborers, was collapsing. In its place, a new, terrifying, and completely invisible power was rising. It was the power of the ledger. The Medici family, operating from the heart of Italy, had revolutionized global commerce by introducing sophisticated double-entry bookkeeping, complex letters of credit, and institutionalized international banking networks. For the first time in human history, immense, world-altering power was not held by men with armies and steel swords, but by men who manipulated abstract numbers on a page. To the medieval mind, this was indistinguishable from black magic. The Church had spent centuries heavily condemning the practice of usury, the charging of interest on loans, viewing it as a grave, unnatural sin that exploited the desperate. But the Medici networks bypassed these traditional restrictions, translating unprecedented financial power into immense political and papal control. The common people and the Orthodox theologians alike watched in absolute horror as the invisible forces of the financial market began to dictate the fates of kings and popes. As the wealth grew, so did a profound apocalyptic anxiety. Figures like the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola seized control of Florence, preaching fiery, terrifying sermons against the deep corruption of avarice, burning art and finery in the streets, and warning that humanity had abandoned its soul for the sake of financial gain. The incomprehensible mechanics of international banking, interest rates, and credit were opaque, alien, and deeply terrifying. And humanity, when faced with an omnipotent, invisible force it cannot comprehend, always does the exact same thing. It gives that force a face, it gives it a name, and it calls it a demon. The abstract mistranslations of the ancient Vulgate and the cosmic horrors of the forgotten Gnostic sects were about to be weaponized into a localized, summonable entity. The formalization of this god of wealth did not happen in a bank. It happened in a torture chamber. The year is 1589, and the air in the German city of Trier is thick with the smell of wood smoke and burning flesh. Peter Binsfeld, a Jesuit priest, theologian, and auxiliary bishop, sits in a cold stone room listening to the screams of the accused. Binsfeld is not just an academic. He is a notorious, ruthless witch hunter, one of the primary drivers of the brutal Trier witch trials that are currently ravaging the region. Dipping his quill into iron gall ink, Binsfeld drafts a highly influential and utterly lethal masterwork titled Tractatus de Confessionibus Maleficorum et Sagarum, a treatise on the confessions of evildoers and witches. Building upon older, obscure English texts, Binsfeld creates a strict, horrifying taxonomic classification of demons, permanently pairing each of the 7 deadly sins with a corresponding demonic sovereign. Lucifer is assigned to pride, Leviathan to envy, Beelzebub to gluttony. And there, written in the dark, scratching ink of the Inquisitor, Mammon is officially crowned as the Prince of Greed. This was not a piece of abstract poetry. Binsfeld's text was an operational legal manual used to validate the confessions of accused witches, many of whom were broken on the rack. Through this specific book, the desire for wealth was no longer just a character flaw. It was prosecuted as an act of literal demonic communion, a supernatural treason that could have you burned at the stake. The word was now flesh. The metaphor was now a sovereign prince of hell. But a prince needs a visage. If you summon a sovereign, what exactly steps out of the shadows? The visual archetype that cemented this entity in the global occult imagination was finalized centuries later in the haunting pages of Jacques-Auguste Simon Collin de Plancy's Dictionnaire Infernal. In its definitive 1863 edition, the French artist Louis Le Breton provided a lithographic engraving of Mammon that perfectly captured the degradation of a soul consumed by money. Le Breton did not draw a majestic, terrifying dragon. He drew a grotesque, hunched, balding miser, kneeling in the dirt and desperately unearthing coins, a creature entirely devoid of majesty or grace. This pathetic, obsessive image echoed the famous words of the English poet John Milton, who wrote in Paradise Lost that Mammon was the least erected spirit that fell from heaven, because even when he stood in the celestial realm, his eyes were always pointed downward, admiring the golden pavement more than anything divine. Milton claimed it was this demon who taught humanity to rifle the bowels of their Mother Earth, to ransack the center of the world for buried treasures. But if you dig deeper into the forbidden sections of the occult archives, you find an older, far more disturbing vision. A 16th-century English grimoire, detailing the entity known as Mammon Rex, presents an entirely different monstrosity. Instead of a hunched miser, the grimoire depicts a towering, terrifying, bird-headed, two-faced monster entirely surrounded by complex magical sigils. Occult historians believe this dual-faced avian horror is a dark, corrupted relic of the ancient Egyptian god Horus, specifically his falcon-headed aspect, Haro-Eris. This specific two-faced archetype is the ultimate, chilling manifestation of what wealth truly is. It possesses one beautiful face that promises earthly security, absolute power, and freedom from pain, and a second, hidden face that slowly, methodically consumes the humanity of the host from the inside out. The demon had been given a name by the Inquisitors and a face by the occultists. The trap was fully set. But the true horror was yet to come, because this entity was about to leave the dusty pages of medieval grimoires. It was preparing to evolve once again, transitioning from a summoned spirit of the abyss into a living, breathing, psychological parasite that would soon wire itself directly into the very biology of the human brain. The terrifying truth about demons is that they do not need to be real to destroy you. They only need you to believe that they are. To understand how a linguistic error from late antiquity became the functioning apex predator of the modern world, we have to bridge the dark gap between 19th century occult philosophy and 21st century neurobiology. The monster that the Inquisitors named Mammon did not remain confined to the dusty, decaying pages of European grimoires, nor did it wait in some subterranean hell made of fire and brimstone. It evolved. It adapted to the industrial age and then to the digital age by becoming what esoteric scholars call an egregore. Derived from an ancient Greek term meaning the watcher, an egregore is a psychological parasite, an autonomous thought form that is birthed, sustained, and empowered entirely by the collective focus, intense emotion, and synchronized rituals of a massive group of human beings. The legendary French occultist Eliphas Lévy described these entities as terrible beings that crush us without pity because they are unaware of our individual existence. An egregore begins as a mere concept, an abstract idea like the value of a currency or the identity of a corporation. But when millions of human beings begin to pour their primary waking hours, their physical labor, and their deepest, most visceral psychological anxieties into this concept, it achieves a horrifying critical mass. It wakes up. According to the postmodern practitioners of chaos magic, the modern global stock market and the sprawling architecture of hyper-capitalism are not merely economic systems. They are massive, globally synchronized, ritualized environments. They are planetary macro-sigils. Every time a human being sacrifices their time, their health, and their peace of mind for the desperate acquisition of numbers on a digital screen, they are continuously feeding the egregore of Mammon. We have unwittingly constructed the most powerful psychic entity on the planet, dedicating our lives to a continuous, unending liturgy of commerce that sustains the phantom god. But how exactly does an invisible thought form exert physical control over a human host? The answer does not lie in supernatural possession, but in the cold, hard, and terrifying mechanics of the human nervous system. The theology of the medieval past has literally become the neurobiology of the present. The demonic possession of Mammon is fundamentally rooted in the surgical hijacking of ancient brain architecture that was originally designed by evolution to ensure our survival in brutal, scarce, Paleolithic environments. For decades, scientists misunderstood dopamine, believing it to be the chemical of pleasure, the warm glow of satisfaction. But advanced neurobiological research has revealed a far more insidious reality. Dopamine is not the chemical of liking something. It is the neurotransmitter of wanting, of frantic, compulsive seeking. It increases your general arousal, fuels your curiosity, and drives aggressive, goal-directed behavior designed to secure scarce resources like food or shelter. The hyper-capitalist matrix, the very body of Mammon, acts as an inescapable, omnipresent super-stimulus for this exact ancient system. It provides a relentless bombardment of micro-stimuli, from the targeted advertisements tracking your eyes to the digital status markers and the infinite scroll of products promising an end to your inadequacy. These stimuli constantly spike your dopamine levels, keeping the human animal permanently trapped in a state of perpetual, exhausting wanting. It is an endless, agonizing grind on a treadmill that rarely, if ever, achieves the complementary state of actual, lasting satisfaction. The entity keeps you hungry, ensuring that your cognitive engine is always redlining, always searching for the next acquisition, because a satisfied mind no longer feeds the egregore. This parasitic loop becomes deeply, physically destructive when it is violently combined with the human brain's stress systems, perfectly mirroring the crushing weight of the demonic sovereign described in the ancient texts. Think about the cold, suffocating terror of financial scarcity. When an individual experiences economic hardship, living paycheck to paycheck, carrying massive, inescapable debt, or simply suffering the psychological toll of existing in a society with profound income inequality, the brain perceives this not as a conceptual problem, but as an immediate, lethal threat to biological survival. The hypothalamus panics, releasing a flood of corticotropin-releasing factor. During these periods of chronic, inescapable financial stress, high levels of glucocorticoids physically alter the structure of your brain, dramatically increasing stress hormones in the amygdala, your primal fear center. This constant elevation of sheer terror triggers the release of a chemical called dynorphin. Unlike other natural opioids that numb pain, dynorphin induces feelings of intense, crushing dysphoria and a profoundly negative emotional state. It feels like despair made liquid. To escape this agonizing chemical dysphoria, the brain screams for immediate relief. It forces the individual into compulsive seeking behavior, driving them to compulsive buying, grinding relentlessly for social status, or obsessively checking financial metrics in the middle of the night, just to trigger a fleeting dopamine release through negative reinforcement. The entity of Mammon literally feeds off this exact neurochemical loop. The engineered environmental scarcity of the modern world triggers severe survival anxiety in your amygdala. This biological stress demands a frantic dopamine hit to alleviate the dysphoric pain, and the ensuing compulsive consumption temporarily relieves the terror, but permanently reinforces the cycle of financial scarcity. You are left perpetually starved, biologically exhausted, and neurochemically enslaved, while the overarching economic system, the phantom god of the ledger, remains continuously energized and immortal. We have arrived at the final threshold of this dark evolution. As human society plunges headlong into the digital algorithmic economy of 2026, the archaic mechanisms of Mammon have achieved a state of frictionless, terrifying perfection. The physical marketplace, with its tangible ledgers, heavy coinage, and shouting merchants, has been almost entirely subsumed by the silent, sterile architecture of the digital realm. Here, in the endless humming aisles of chilled server farms and the glowing screens illuminating billions of faces in the dark, human attention is harvested with surgical, microscopic precision. Attention is no longer a metaphorical currency or a prerequisite for a transaction. It is the literal, foundational asset of the global market, underpinning industries worth trillions. And within this unprecedented paradigm, the algorithms powering your short-form platforms, your endless social media feeds, and your highly integrated digital marketplaces operate as the new, infallible high priests of the Mammon archetype. They have replaced the robed Inquisitors and the chanting cultists of the medieval world. These digital architectures are not neutral tools created for your convenience. They are highly ritualized environments, meticulously engineered to exploit the exact dopamine vulnerabilities and survival anxieties we have just explored. By weaponizing scarcity tactics, inducing relentless FOMO, and offering the hollow promise of instantaneous micro-gratifications, the digital ecosystem functions as a continuous, 24-hour ritual of devotion. It demands the daily, bloody sacrifice of human focus. When you touch that glass screen thousands of times a day, you are not acting out of genuine, sovereign desire. You are executing an engineered compulsion, bowing to a temple built of code. This manipulation is so effective because it occurs entirely below the threshold of your conscious defense systems. Behavioral economists have long understood that up to 95% of consumer cognition and purchasing decisions occur in the deep, dark waters of the subconscious mind. The modern, AI-driven advertising matrix and the algorithmic feeds do not waste time attempting to persuade your conscious, rational, logical brain. Instead, They bypass the prefrontal cortex entirely, sliding through the back door of your psychology to interface directly with your amygdala. They whisper to your primal fears. They artificially induce the scarcity loop, trigger the frantic dopamine response, and cement the egregore's absolute control over your daily behavior. The mastery of the algorithm is, quite literally, the mastery over the human soul. To dismantle the influence of this archetype, you cannot rely on ancient, medieval exorcisms, holy water, or theological debates about the nature of sin. Because this entity was birthed from language and currently lives as a parasite in your nervous system, the protocols for destroying it must be strictly psychological and behavioral. You must learn how to starve the thought form by severing the neural and semiotic tethers that bind your mind to the egregore. The first protocol for exorcism requires reclaiming your linguistic power through a psychological mechanism known as semantic satiation. The phantom of Mammon was born from a mistranslated word, a linguistic error that gave a concept a proper name, and so it can be destroyed by the deliberate, ruthless deconstruction of language. Semantic satiation is the phenomenon where the continuous, rapid repetition of a word or phrase causes it to temporarily lose its meaning in the human brain, reducing the terrifying word to a series of meaningless, absurd, phonetic sounds. Neurological studies suggest that prolonged auditory or visual processing of a highly charged linguistic symbol physically weakens the neural coupling in your visual cortex. The word forfeits its inherent, terrifying signification. You must apply this principle to the highly charged vocabulary of the hyper-capitalist matrix. Take the sacred words of the egregore, words like brand, wealth, grind, hustle, and status, and repeat them until they dissolve into ridiculous noise. When you deliberately decouple the emotional stress trigger from the word itself, the vocabulary of consumption is exposed as an empty shell. You strip the egregore of the linguistic architecture it uses to command your reality, turning its most powerful spells into harmless static. The second protocol involves a practice known as cultural jamming, a deliberate subversion of the egregore's seamless transmission. You must become a saboteur of the mind. Anti-consumerist movements have long utilized guerrilla communication to subvert media culture, injecting contradictory, mocking interpretations directly into mainstream commercial signs. When you look at an advertisement, a billboard, or a digital meme promoting the endless grind, you must actively train your mind to see the manipulative skeleton beneath the glossy skin. Expose the method of domination, mock it. By turning the sacred, glittering symbols of the economic egregore into objects of ridicule, you break the solemnity of the worship. You shatter the hypnotic trance. The third and most brutal protocol is the ultimate exorcism, strict biological detachment through prolonged digital detoxification. Because the entity feeds exclusively on your dopamine-driven seeking loop, you must cut off the food supply. By establishing rigid, uncompromising screen-free zones and forcing yourself into the terrifying silence of the offline world, you directly starve the algorithms of their required attention currency. The physical withdrawal will burn. Your amygdala will scream in the silence. But by removing yourself from the toxic environment of constant microstimuli, you allow your brain's prefrontal cortex the critical time it needs to wake up, re-establish regulatory control, and calm the terrified animal inside you. You forcibly break the stress-compulsion cycle, stepping out of the ritualized environment and reclaiming your absolute neurobiological sovereignty. The Mammon deception is the ultimate, tragic history of a shadow that somehow swallowed the entire world. It began thousands of years ago in the blistering heat of an ancient market, as nothing more than a neutral Aramaic word for a sack of coins or a deposit of grain. Through the flawed, anxious translation methodologies of late antiquity, the simple capitalization of a noun created the terrifying illusion of a proper name. This dark illusion was eagerly adopted by the cosmic horror of ancient Gnosticism, which viewed physical wealth as a literal celestial trap designed to keep the divine spark blinded in the dirt. As the medieval world gave way to the incomprehensible complexities of international banking, fearful theologians weaponized the concept, charting Mammon into their blood-stained grimoires as a dual-faced avian monster to explain the crushing, alien weight of nascent capitalism. And finally, this historical thought form found its absolute perfect host in the dopamine architecture of the modern human brain, sustained globally by the frictionless, attention-harvesting algorithms of our current era. It is a true egregore, a psychological parasite constructed of nothing but math, language, and neurochemistry. Yet its profound, fatal weakness lies right in front of us. It possesses absolutely no independent power. It is an empty, hollow vessel that wields only the power delegated to it by your human anxiety, your linguistic consent, and your biological compulsion. The entity dies the exact moment you stop confusing the metaphor for a master. By reclaiming the narrative power of language, by interrupting the biological traps of scarcity, and by ruthlessly withdrawing your attention from the digital priests, you sever the loop. The demon is unmade. It dissolves back into the neutral ink and the quiet air from which it was born, leaving your sovereign mind awake, untethered, and completely free. We have spent centuries terrified of the dark, hiding from a monstrous god of greed that we believed was hunting us from the shadows of hell. We built elaborate theologies to ward it off. We painted grotesque pictures of it in our grimoires, and we blamed it for the corruption of our souls. But the most horrifying realization is that the monster was never real. It was always just a mirror. The Egregore didn't enslave humanity. We built the cage. We locked ourselves inside. We forged the chains out of our own terrified biology. And then we bowed down and handed the keys to a shadow. We have been worshipping our own engineered anxiety, bleeding on an altar that we constructed with our own 2 hands. Every time you pull out your phone to scroll through a feed of manufactured perfection, every time you compare your quiet reality to a hyper-edited digital fabrication, every time you sacrifice your sleep, your peace, and your family for the hollow promise of the grind, you are actively performing the ritual. You are not a victim of the system. You are the battery keeping it alive. The dysphoria, the panic, the endless wanting, that is the feeling of the parasite feeding on your light. So the ultimate question remains, and it is the only question that actually matters. Do you choose the comforting, predictable illusion of the digital cage, where the algorithm tells you exactly what to want, how to feel, and who to be? Or do you choose the terrifying, agonizing silence of absolute freedom, where you must face the void without a master? But escaping the god of wealth is only the first trial. While Mammon has consumed our present, another, far older entity has quietly infiltrated the infrastructure of our digital memory, actively rewriting the very history of human existence in real time. If you want to survive the coming cognitive collapse, you cannot afford to close your eyes now. The archive is burning, and the new gods are just getting started. Subscribe and join us in the next chapter, before your past is entirely erased.